I never expected my 32nd birthday to be the day my entire world collapsed. But there I was, standing in my kitchen at 7 in the morning, holding a pale blue envelope that made my hand shake like I was holding a live wire. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in October. My husband James was already at work. The coffee was brewing, and I was going through the mail before heading to my job at the veterinary clinic. Bills, advertisements, a magazine subscription renewal notice, and then this envelope with my name written in handwriting I recognized but couldn't place. The address was correct, down to our apartment number, but there was no return address, just a local postmark from 3 days ago. When I opened it, expecting maybe a late birthday card from a distant relative or family friend, I found a simple card with a watercolor butterfly on the front. Nothing unusual about that. My grandmother always said butterflies were symbols of transformation, of souls taking flight, so I'd grown up associating them with her gentle wisdom and warm hugs. But when I opened the card, my breath caught in my throat like I'd been punched. The message inside was written in the same careful cursive I'd seen on grocery lists, birthday cards, and Christmas presents for the first 18 years of my life. Happy birthday, my sweet Emma. I hope this year brings you all the happiness you deserve. You've grown into such a beautiful woman, and I'm so proud of who you've become. Love always, Grandma Rose. The problem was that Grandma Rose had been dead for 10 years. I'd been at her funeral. I'd watched them lower her casket into the ground at Riverside Cemetery on a rainy March afternoon that felt like the end of everything good in my childhood. I'd kept her favorite recipe book, her pearl earrings, and a photograph of us baking cookies together when I was 12. I'd visited her grave every year on the anniversary of her death, bringing fresh daffodils because they were her favorite flowers. So seeing her signature on this card, written in handwriting that looked exactly like hers, made my knees weak and my vision blur around the edges. I sat down hard in one of our kitchen chairs, still holding the card like it might disappear if I looked away. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep the card steady enough to read it again. The handwriting was perfect. Every loop and curve exactly as I remembered from years of receiving her letters when I was away at college. She always wrote in blue ink, always signed with the same flourish on the R in Rose, always added a little heart after her name. All of those details were there, precise and familiar, like she'd written it yesterday instead of a decade after her death. My first thought was that someone was playing a cruel joke, but who would do such a thing? James wouldn't find this funny, and neither would any of our friends. My parents lived 3 states away, and barely remembered my birthday most years, let alone would orchestrate something this elaborate and disturbing. My sister Katie was deployed overseas with the military, and had been for the past 8 months. The few relatives I still kept in touch with lived scattered across the country, and had never been particularly close to Grandma Rose anyway. None of them would have known her handwriting well enough to forge it so perfectly, and none of them would have understood how much this would devastate me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an old card she'd written before she died, something that had gotten lost in the mail system for years and was just now being delivered. But that didn't make sense either. The card looked new, not like something that had been sitting in a postal facility for a decade. The envelope was crisp and clean. The postmark was recent, and the card itself had that fresh smell of new paper and ink. Plus, the message mentioned me being a beautiful woman and growing up, which suggested it was written by someone who knew what I looked like now, not the 18-year-old girl I'd been when Grandma Rose passed away. I found myself studying every detail of the card obsessively. The butterfly on the front was painted in soft pastels, exactly the kind of gentle, pretty image my grandmother would have chosen. The paper had a subtle texture that felt expensive between my fingers. Inside, below the message, there was a tiny drawing of a daisy in the corner, something my grandmother used to doodle when she was thinking. She'd draw little flowers on napkins while we talked, on the margins of letters, on the condensation on windows when we were waiting for the rain to stop. It was such a specific, personal detail that it made my chest tight with a mixture of grief and confusion. The more I looked at the card, the more convinced I became that this wasn't a prank or a mistake. Someone had deliberately chosen to send me this, had taken the time to study my grandmother's handwriting and replicate it with frightening accuracy, had known about her little habits and quirks, had understood exactly how to reach into my heart and twist. But why? What could anyone possibly gain from making me believe my dead grandmother had somehow sent me a birthday card? The thought made me feel sick and paranoid, like there were eyes watching me that I couldn't see, like someone had been studying my life and my memories without my knowledge. I called in sick to work that morning. I couldn't imagine trying to focus on examining pets and comforting worried owners when my mind was spinning with questions and possibilities. Instead, I spent the day pacing around our apartment, picking up the card and putting it down again, trying to make sense of something that seemed impossible. By the time James came home that evening, I'd probably read the message 50 times, hoping it would somehow reveal its secrets or transform into something that made sense. When James walked through our front door that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the card spread out in front of me like evidence at a crime scene. I'd spent hours staring at it, comparing it to old letters I'd kept in a shoebox under our bed, trying to find some flaw or inconsistency that would prove it was fake. But the more I studied it, the more authentic it appeared. Every detail was perfect, from the way she dotted her I's to the slight rightward slant of her letters that came from decades of writing quickly while working as a secretary. James took one look at my face and knew something was seriously wrong. He'd seen me upset before, but this was different. This was the kind of bone-deep disturbance that comes from having your understanding of reality suddenly called into question. When I showed him the card and explained the situation, he went through the same process I had. First disbelief, then careful examination, then growing concern as he realized how perfect the forgery was, if that's what it was. "Emma, this is incredible," he said, holding the card up to the light as if that might reveal some hidden truth. "I mean, this looks exactly like her handwriting from those letters you showed me when we first started dating. How is that even possible?" James had never met my grandmother, but he'd seen enough of her correspondence over the years to recognize her distinctive style. He'd even helped me organize her papers after she died, sorting through decades of letters, grocery lists, and journal entries. He knew what her handwriting looked like almost as well as I did. We spent that evening trying to come up with logical explanations. Maybe someone had found an old, unused card she'd prepared years ago and decided to mail it now. Maybe there was a relative I'd forgotten about who had access to samples of her handwriting and the skills to replicate it. Maybe it was some kind of delayed postal delivery, though we both knew that was stretching credibility past the breaking point. Every theory we proposed had holes in it, gaps in logic that we couldn't bridge with reasonable assumptions. James suggested we contact the postal service to trace where the card had originated, but when I called the next morning, they told me that without evidence of a crime, they couldn't provide detailed tracking information for mail that had already been delivered. The postmark told us it had been sent locally, within a 50-mile radius of our city, but that still left thousands of potential senders. We considered hiring a private investigator, but what would we tell them? That we wanted them to find out who was impersonating my dead grandmother. It sounded crazy even to us. The second card arrived exactly 1 week later. This time, it was a thinking of you card with a painting of a garden on the front, and the message inside was even more specific and personal. "My dear Emma, I've been watching over you and James, and I'm so happy to see how much love you have in your life. Remember what I always told you about planting seeds of kindness wherever you go. The daffodils in my garden are blooming beautifully this year. I wish you could see them. All my love, Grandma Rose." The mention of daffodils made my heart race. My grandmother had always grown daffodils in her backyard, and every spring she'd cut fresh bouquets to put in vases around her house. It was one of my strongest memories of visiting her, walking through her garden while she pointed out different varieties and told me their names. But here's the thing that made this card even more disturbing than the first. My grandmother's house had been sold years ago, and the new owners had completely redesigned the landscaping. There were no daffodils there anymore. I knew because I'd driven by the old house just months ago, feeling nostalgic and a little melancholy. The garden she'd loved so much had been replaced with modern, minimalist plantings that looked nothing like the cottage garden she'd tended for decades. So how could whoever was writing these cards know about the daffodils? How could they write about her garden blooming as if it still existed in the form she'd loved? It suggested a knowledge of my grandmother's life and preferences that went beyond what someone could learn from studying her handwriting or reading old letters. It suggested an intimacy with her personality and her world that should have been impossible for anyone still living. I started keeping a journal of everything I could remember about my grandmother, trying to create a comprehensive record of her habits, her expressions, her favorite things. I wanted to be prepared if more cards arrived, to test whether the sender really knew her or was just making educated guesses based on generic grandmother stereotypes. I wrote down her favorite recipes, the songs she hummed while cooking, the way she always kept peppermints in her purse, her habit of talking to her plants as if they were old friends. The list grew longer each day as memories surfaced that I'd forgotten I had. James was getting worried about my obsession with the cards. He'd find me up at 2 a.m, sitting at the computer researching handwriting analysis or reading about fraud investigation techniques. I'd started checking the mail before he got home each day, my stomach churning with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Part of me was terrified of receiving another card, but another part of me was desperate for more contact with whoever was doing this, more clues that might help me understand what was happening. Emma, you need to consider the possibility that this is someone who genuinely cares about you, James said one evening, after I'd spent 3 hours comparing the cards to old Christmas letters. What if it's not meant to be cruel? What if someone is trying to bring you comfort by keeping your grandmother's memory alive? But comfort was the last thing I felt when I looked at those cards. They filled me with unease and questions that multiplied faster than I could answer them. The third card arrived on what would have been my grandmother's 85th birthday, a detail that convinced me whoever was sending these knew far more about my family than any stranger should. This card was different from the others. Instead of a commercial greeting card, it was handmade, with pressed flowers glued to heavy cardstock and a message written on delicate paper that looked like it had been torn from an old journal. The handwriting was the same, but the tone was more urgent, more personal. Emma, my darling girl, I need you to know that I never really left you. Death isn't what people think it is. I've been trying to find a way to reach you for so long, and finally I can. There are things you need to understand about our family, about why I had to leave when I did. Look in the place where we used to hide our secret treasures. You'll find what you need to know. Don't let anyone tell you this isn't real. Trust your heart, like I always taught you. Forever yours, Grandma Rose. The reference to secret treasures made my hands shake so violently I almost dropped the card. When I was little, my grandmother and I had a game where we'd hide small presents for each other around her house. A piece of candy tucked behind a book, a pretty rock placed in a jewelry box, a flower pressed between the pages of a magazine. She called them secret treasures, and finding them was one of my favorite parts of visiting her. But I'd never told anyone about that game, not even James. It was something special between my grandmother and me, a private tradition that had died with her. I drove to my grandmother's old house that afternoon, my heart pounding as I parked across the street and stared at the building where I'd spent so many happy hours as a child. The current owners had painted it a different color and replaced the front porch, but the basic structure was the same. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to knock on the door and ask if I could look around. How do you explain to strangers that you need to search their house for clues left by your dead grandmother? Finally, I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. A woman in her 40s answered, looking puzzled but not unfriendly. I introduced myself as the granddaughter of the previous owner and explained that I was trying to locate some family mementos that might have been left behind when the house was sold. She was surprisingly understanding and invited me inside, though she warned me that they'd done extensive renovations and might not have much of the original structure intact. The house looked completely different inside. Walls had been removed, the kitchen had been gutted and rebuilt, and most of the built-in cabinets and shelves where my grandmother and I used to hide our treasures had been replaced with modern fixtures. I felt a crushing disappointment as I realized that whatever the card writer wanted me to find was probably long gone, destroyed in the renovation process. But then the woman mentioned that they'd left the attic mostly untouched because they used it primarily for storage. With permission, I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, flashlight in hand, feeling like I was entering a time capsule. The space smelled like old wood and dust, exactly as I remembered it. My grandmother had used the attic to store Christmas decorations, old photographs, and boxes of things she couldn't bear to throw away, but didn't need in daily life. Most of her belongings had been cleared out after she died, but I could see a few forgotten items scattered in the corners. In the far corner, behind an old dresser that was too heavy for the estate sale company to bother moving, I found a small wooden box I recognized immediately. It was a jewelry box my grandfather had made for my grandmother before I was born, with a tiny dancer that spun when you opened the lid. I'd played with it countless times as a child, fascinated by the delicate mechanism and the soft music it played. Seeing it there, forgotten and covered in dust, made my throat tight with emotion. Inside the box Underneath a tangle of costume jewelry and old buttons, I found an envelope with my name written on it in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open it. Inside was a letter, dated just 2 weeks before my grandmother's death, along with a small brass key and a map drawn on notebook paper. The letter was longer than the cards, written in the same careful script, but with more urgency, as if she'd been racing against time. My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, it means I found a way to guide you here even after I'm gone. I've been having dreams lately, dreams that feel more real than waking life, and in them I can see things that haven't happened yet. I know this sounds impossible, but I've seen you as a grown woman, married to a kind man with gentle eyes, living in a small apartment with plants on the windowsill. I've seen you struggling with questions about our family, and I've seen you needing answers that only I can provide. The letter went on to explain that the brass key opened a safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown, a box she'd rented in secret and never told anyone about. She'd filled it with documents and photographs she said would explain everything about our family's history, things she'd never felt brave enough to share while she was alive. The map showed the location of the bank and included the box number and her personal identification code. I sat in that dusty attic for an hour, reading and rereading the letter, trying to process what it meant. Either my grandmother had somehow predicted her own death and orchestrated an elaborate posthumous treasure hunt, or someone with incredible knowledge of our relationship, and her handwriting had planted this letter years ago, knowing I would eventually find it. Both possibilities seemed equally impossible, but the evidence was right there in my hands. The next morning, I stood outside First National Bank with the brass key clutched in my sweaty palm, still not entirely convinced I wasn't losing my mind. James had insisted on coming with me, partly for moral support and partly because he was worried about my mental state. I'd barely slept the night before, my head spinning with questions and possibilities that ranged from the supernatural to the simply inexplicable. The bank manager, a professional woman in her 50s named Mrs. Henderson, looked skeptical when I explained that I needed to access a safety deposit box that had belonged to my grandmother. She asked for identification and documentation, proving my relationship to the deceased. Standard procedure that I hadn't anticipated. Fortunately, I'd brought copies of my grandmother's death certificate and my birth certificate showing her as my grandmother, along with the letter I'd found in the attic. Mrs. Henderson examined the documents carefully, then consulted her computer records. "I do show a box registered to Rose Margaret Coleman," she said slowly, "but it's been inactive for over 10 years. The rental fees have been paid automatically from an account that still has funds in it. That's unusual." She looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Are you sure you want to open this? Sometimes families find things they weren't prepared to discover." With trembling hands, I inserted the brass key into the lock of box 347. It turned smoothly, as if it had been used recently instead of sitting untouched for a decade. Inside the long metal box were stacks of documents, photograph albums, and several sealed envelopes with dates written on them in my grandmother's handwriting. The dates spanned from the week after my 18th birthday to just days before her death, as if she'd been adding to this collection gradually over her final years. The first envelope I opened contained photographs I'd never seen before, pictures of my grandmother as a young woman with people I didn't recognize. But as I studied them more closely, I realized some of the faces looked familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. There were several photos of a woman who looked almost exactly like me, but dressed in clothing from the 1940s. The resemblance was so strong it was like looking at pictures of myself in costume. James pointed to one photograph in particular. "Emma, look at this woman's hands." I looked and gasped. The woman in the photo had the same distinctive birthmark on her left wrist that I'd inherited, a small crescent-shaped mark that looked like a tiny moon. It was such a specific detail that coincidence seemed impossible. The documents told an even stranger story. Birth certificates, immigration records, and family trees that traced our lineage back several generations, revealing a pattern that made my head spin. According to these papers, women in our family line had been experiencing prophetic dreams and supernatural encounters for over a century. My grandmother had apparently spent years researching this phenomenon, documenting instances where family members had received messages from deceased relatives or had visions of future events. One thick folder contained detailed accounts of these experiences, written in various handwritings by different family members over the decades. Stories of great-grandmothers who predicted deaths, aunts who received visits from deceased husbands, cousins who found hidden messages years after loved ones had passed away. Reading these accounts, I realized that what was happening to me wasn't unique in our family. It was part of a pattern that stretched back generations. The final envelope was sealed with wax and marked, "For Emma, when she understands." Inside was a letter that explained everything, written in my grandmother's handwriting, but with a clarity and detail that suggested she'd had help composing it. The letter revealed that my grandmother had indeed been sending the cards, not through any supernatural means, but through a carefully planned system she'd arranged before her death. She'd enlisted the help of Margaret Sullivan, her closest friend and neighbor, who was now living in a retirement community about 30 miles from our city. Margaret had been instructed to send the cards at specific times, using samples of my grandmother's handwriting and personal information she'd provided in detailed notes. The goal wasn't to deceive me, but to guide me to this moment, to these discoveries about our family history that my grandmother had felt were too important to die with her. The letter included Margaret's phone number and address, along with instructions to contact her once I'd found the safety deposit box. When I called that afternoon, Margaret's voice was warm and familiar, though I hadn't heard it in years. She confirmed everything the letter had revealed and invited me to visit her the next day. Margaret, now 82 and sharp as ever, welcomed me into her small apartment with tears in her eyes. "Your grandmother made me promise to carry out her plan exactly as she'd written it," she explained. "She was convinced that you'd inherited the family gift for receiving messages from beyond, and she wanted to prove it to you in a way you couldn't dismiss as coincidence or imagination." Over tea and cookies, Margaret showed me the detailed instructions my grandmother had left, including samples of her handwriting, notes about personal memories to reference, and a timeline for when each card should be sent. She'd even left money to cover postage and supplies, along with backup plans in case Margaret became unable to fulfill her promise. "She loved you more than you'll ever know," Margaret said, patting my hand gently, "and she was terrified that the family gift would die with her if she didn't find a way to awaken it in you. She spent her final months planning this, hoping it would help you understand that love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to express itself." I left Margaret's apartment that day with a strange sense of peace. The mystery was solved, but it had been replaced by something even more profound. The knowledge that my grandmother's love for me had been so strong that she'd found a way to reach across the barrier of death itself, not through supernatural means, but through the very human power of careful planning and devoted friendship. The cards stopped coming after that, but I didn't need them anymore. I had something better, the understanding that the people we lose never really leave us, as long as we're willing to look for the ways they continue to show their love.